We enter this Labor Day weekend, the traditional kickoff of the midterm campaign homestretch, with a cloud hanging over this election, the Mueller investigation. It's showing no signs of slowing down, and the president still lashing out at it and at the attorney general he believes could and should have stopped the probe from ever being launched. Trump last night at a rally in Indiana.
But our Justice Department and our FBI have to start doing their job and doing it right and doing it now. Because people are angry. People are angry. What's happening is a disgrace. And at some point, I wanted to stay out, but at some point, if it doesn't straighten out properly, I want them to do their job. I will get involved, and I'll get in there if I have to. Disgraceful.
And those comments came just hours after Trump seemed to tell Bloomberg News that Attorney General Jeff Sessions' job is safe through the November midterm, but maybe not beyond that. Trump continuing to complain about Sessions' reluctance to investigate his political enemies.
I'd just like to have Jeff Sessions do his job. And if he did, I'd be very happy. But the job entails two sides, not one side.
Trump also said he views the Mueller probe as an illegal investigation and also insisting there should have never been a special counsel. Today, they're offering another reminder of the scope and reach of the Russia investigation and the possibility of more legal exposure for President Trump and his campaign. Sam Patten, a former associate of Paul Manafort, pleading guilty today to charges brought by the Office of the U.S. Attorney in Washington for failing to register as a foreign lobbyist. Patten also admitted that he made a $50,000 illegal donation to President Trump's inauguration committee, acting as a so-called straw donor for a Russian and a Ukrainian banned from making contribution themselves. Patten has agreed to cooperate with Mueller's investigation. I am joined now by Tom Winter, NBC News investigative reporter, Susan Del Percio, Republican strategist, David Corn, Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones, and Barry Grissom, former U.S. attorney. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Tom, let me start with you just on this news. Sam Patten pleading guilty today, illegal donation, straw man for Trump inaugural committee. What do we know about who he is, how he fits into Trump world? What can you tell us?
So Sam Patten is not somebody that was associated with the Trump campaign, but he is somebody who is associated with Konstantin Kilimnik, who's somebody who's been charged, along with Paul Manafort, for witness tampering in Paul Manafort's upcoming case in D.C. So this is somebody who has connections to people inside the Trump orbit. This is somebody who's done business in Ukraine. And I think the big headline here today is that we have illegal foreign donations coming into the Trump inaugural committee. Now, there's no indication from the court paperwork here, Steve, that any of these donations, that the fact that it was the original source of the money came from a foreign person was something that the Trump inaugural committee knew. But you do now have essentially Russian and Ukrainian money. One of the people that was involved, the government says in their court paperwork, is a Russian, somebody who has ties to Russian intelligence. That's Konstantin Kilimnik. And the other person is a Ukrainian oligarch. They actually were able to get tickets to the inauguration by doing a $50,000 straw donation. In plain English, that just means that they asked somebody to buy the tickets for them because you can't put foreign money into an inaugural committee. So that's how this all came together today, and I think that's a pretty astounding headline.
And we say this is the U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C. bringing these charges. This is not Mueller. So do we know if there's going to be a connection here, if the next step is Mueller talks, or do we know anything about that?
Exactly. It's a great question. So we know from our own reporter in the courtroom today, Gary Grumbach, that in fact Andrew Weissman, who is one of the people that's involved in the Manafort prosecution, he was in the court today. And very specifically in the plea agreement, it says not only is he to cooperate with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., but he's also supposed to cooperate with the special counsel's office, Robert Mueller. So that's part of Patten's cooperation agreement. So we can expect here for him to be talking to both Mueller's team as well as prosecutors, federal prosecutors in Washington, D.C. So, yeah, they're definitely a part of this.
And David Corn, let me bring you in because I know you've written extensively on this topic, and I think these names may not be new to you. What do you make of this news, this development, and specifically this idea that the inaugural committee, donating to the inaugural committee, apparently getting tickets in exchange for that? What do you make of that?
Well, we do know that federal prosecutors have been very interested in contributions to the inaugural committee. And Mother Jones, who reported on major, six-figure donations that came in from the cousin of a Russian oligarch who runs his business interests here. Now, he's an American, he's not a Russian, but that too is very suspicious. So it's interesting that finally some of this is turning into legal matters, criminal prosecutions. The other big thing here that Tom didn't mention is that in this plea deal, Sam Patten admitted to lying to Congress. He came before the Senate Intelligence Committee and gave testimony privately, and he lied about what he was doing in terms of representing Ukraine in these straw contributions. Now, this is key, because Adam Schiff and other Democrats have asked for investigations of witnesses who have come before the committees investigating the Trump-Russia scandal on the basis of perhaps lying to Congress, which is a crime whether you're sworn or not. And they've raised questions about Donald Trump Jr.'s testimony, Roger Stone's testimony, Eric Prince's testimony, and others. So if we're going to get federal prosecutors looking at the testimony given to these committees and looking for instances of lying, it could open up a whole new horizon for the Mueller probe.
And Barry Grissom, this also points to a pattern I think we've seen with this whole question of the Mueller investigation, more broadly the Russia investigation. There will be new developments that emerge to the sort of the layman public, people like me, that'll come out of nowhere and yet will then loom as very significant moving forward. Here, another potential example of that. So we are reminded of the potential for developments like this. We are also, as we said, approaching the Labor Day weekend, this supposed 60-day rule, not an official rule, but this sort of tradition in prosecutions of you kind of hold off for the 2 months leading up to Election Day. Do you have a sense that that means for the next 2 months we're not going to be getting much more, or are we still going to be learning more about, whether it's this case with Sam Patten or more between now and Election Day?
Well, I think Mr. Mueller is going to abide by the department's policy, and he's not going to bring anything in that's going to be an October surprise. If we've learned nothing about Bob Mueller, you know that he is a by-the-books guy. He's not going to jump the gun. He's going to continue with the investigation as he has up to this point in time. And it looks as if once he has his findings, that will be released after the midterm elections are over. But you have to look back at what he's done to date. We're talking about a planned approach by the president and his folks to go out there and consider this or call this a witch hunt, that this is a rigged election. Well, we have a situation where Mr. Flynn has pled guilty. Mr. Cohen, his counsel, has pled guilty. Mr. Gates has pled guilty. Mr. Manafort has been found guilty on 8 counts and may well be tried on the remaining counts in addition to the trial in D.C., as well as today we hear about Mr. Patten's involvement. All of these various prosecutions are based on facts. Nothing is made up. When people use the term fake facts or fake news, these are facts that people plead guilty to at the risk of losing their liberty and suffering heavy fines. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about Mr. Mueller and his investigation. But I doubt very seriously we're going to hear anything before the midterms.
And Tom, on this question of the 60-day rule, you have some information there?
Yeah, just briefly. I think the thing that controls the special counsel's office, my understanding is it's an Eric Holder memo. And I think if you got to read that memo closely, because there's no time that's listed on that memo as far as any sort of specific window. And really the key to it is you can't bring an action against a particular candidate or a campaign for the purpose of influencing that candidate or campaign. Everybody that we're talking about here is not running for office. Donald Trump Jr. is not running for office. Jared Kushner is not running for office. The president is not running for office. I use them as examples. I'm not saying those are people that are necessarily going to face legal jeopardy, but I just think we have to keep that in mind here. There's nothing here, based upon reading that memo, that necessarily says...
Well, right, and what is on the ballot, Susan, is the president's party. And I got to think, if you are a Republican candidate for office right now, you're looking at the next 2 months and you're saying, please, no more of this from today through Election Day.
Well, and we know there's going to be more because we know Manafort's trial is starting in a couple of weeks. So we know it's going to be about a 4-week trial. There will be a verdict in that trial, one way or the other. So we will see products of the Mueller investigation going forward. We may see another Patten. But Republicans are most hoping that Trump will keep his mouth shut on this because I know. Is that David?
Sorry,
he had to laugh. I know. No, but the reason why is if you're talking about that, those 30 to 60 days that that Manafort's supposed to not do anything, then the campaign, then the Giuliani spokesperson role has to also kind of keep a lid on it during that
I'm
time
curious,
period.
what is a Republican in a competitive race? If we're dealing with Trump coming out there, calling this investigation a witch hunt, whatever it may be, a couple weeks before election, what is that Republican candidate going to do? Is the Republican candidate going to be thinking, hey, the swing voters do not want to hear the president talking about this, about an investigation like this? Or are they going to be thinking, I need those Trump voters?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.